So the way I did my presentation, like I said, I was expecting to go last. So I was expecting that you were going to hear these other three speakers that were going to give a lot of specific application to Detroit and the issues, and I could kind of see what they were saying and see if there were any things left to say. But mine, maybe I think of, you can think of it as a big picture then, and then the others would give you some smaller pictures. When I was given this syllabus, I was attracted to Charles Mill's The Racial Contract. Y'all read that? I was attracted to it, one, because I'm have some training as a philosopher, and two, and he really challenges the notion of philosophy and the way it's practiced, you know, in Western societies. And two, I was attracted to this notion of a contract because y'all know more than I do. You know, a contract is a document that's freely signed between two parties. You know, and so there's this sense of equality, there's this sense of freedom, there's this sense of, you know, these two bodies that have an agreement. And so I really wanted to interrogate that, and in some ways I think that it's a contract that one party, which would be the African descendants on this land mass, have never signed. You know, and so I'll talk more about that. I really am so glad that Peter Hammer and the school is focusing this discussion on colonialism in Detroit, which is very rarely, you know, it's a leap from equity to colonialism. But my point is, why are we even having these discussions? I would say it's because, it's not because Detroit is a former French colony. It's not because Detroit is in the state of Michigan. It's very explicitly because of Detroit's majority African black population. And secondly, because of the historical attempts by political and social leadership to use the available systems of politics and economy to meet the needs of the majority of the people. Meaning there have been many examples throughout history, and I didn't prepare to talk about all those examples, but maybe we can at question and answer or something like that, in which different social and political leaders in Detroit said, you know what, we have a majority black population and we need to create institutions and do institutions slightly differently, you know, maybe greatly differently than the rest of these institutions in America. And so it's because of this collective decision making that we see a lot of the policies that we will call colonialism. A lot of equity is about individual life outcomes. What happens to you? What happens to your family? What's your health? But it's great to talk about collective outcomes, which is essential when talking about colonialism. I didn't read the Charles Mill book. I think I read it like when I was in grad school or something. But I read a couple articles that had, you know, commentary and analysis, feminist analysis, and he wrote one years later, what did he think, and why he thought everything was pretty much the same. But one thing that I see that he wrote his goal is, he called it the excessively demanding norm of equal, race-irrelevant citizenship in a modern Western liberal democracy. So his goal is, how can we get these different racial people, these different ethnic people, to get citizenship in a way that's racially irrelevant in America, which he calls a modern Western democracy. And that's one goal, that's a cool goal, but I wanted to point out, in the majority of my time, is to point out, when we look at the Black liberation movement, there's another goal. Many of us will call his goal integrationism. You know, he wants to be fully integrated, successfully integrated, competently integrated into America as a democracy. This other way questions whether integrationism is historical or is the best approach for black people. But many times academics have been scared to engage it seriously. Many times people have been scared to teach it to their students, as it may contradict their goals of career progress. And this other way has been repressed for decades, centuries, depending on how you look at it, by military and police violence, by infiltration, and by imprisonment. So it's far from celebrated as the civil rights movements. And even many serious black people today hardly understand that it exists. And this analysis asserts that we are not merely racially subjugated citizens of the U.S. who just happen to be missing out on equality, but rather we are a colonized nation that has been denied self-rule and self-determination. And in some ways, I think it takes Mill's points and it takes this notion of the racial contract to an even deeper conclusion. So again, what I'm saying, and the whole theme of what I'm talking about is this switch from not looking us as citizens who are racially subjugated that just happen to not have equality in the United States, but that collectively we are a nation that was formed and colonized over a process of centuries and has been denied self-rule and self-determination. One quote that I like from Charles Mills, "Now the gang is all coming." This is beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. The energy is building. One of the quotes is that from Charles Mills, he says, "Non-whites frequently internalize their sub-personhood or see themselves through white eyes by accepting their prescribed roles of servant and menial labor, comic coons and Sambos, grateful Uncle Toms, and Aunt Jemimas." And he writes this story, he writes his article, he writes his book to overcome the internalization of sub-personhood. And I think that when I talk about colonization, when I think of colonization and I think of personhood as it applies all throughout the globe, I'll just say it that way. I don't want to just look at personhood from the United States point of view. I want to look at personhood all throughout the globe. And what we see is that nationhood is a very relevant and important vehicle for human dignity and for collective self-determination. And many people, many black people, many of our people have accepted this sub-personhood to such an extent that we can see ourselves as being Americans, and we can see ourselves, hopefully one day, maybe we can get equality, but we can't see ourselves as a nation. And we can't see ourselves saying that we can have collective self-determination in which we would be able to control our own destiny as a collective people. And so I think that this look really pushes what is personhood on a global scale much further. And there's a few pieces of context that I want to give. One is the work of Malcolm X. And Malcolm X, he was when he was alive, he really challenged the civil rights movement. He challenged black people all around the country and the world. And one of the things that stuck with me is that he challenged folks to move from civil rights to human rights. He challenged folks from moving from begging the United States to treat us equally to who are we on a global scale, and who are we as relates to what does it look like when we sit at the table of nations, what does it look like when we sit as equals with people all around the world. And those who, what I'm going to talk about is called the Republic of New Africa. And those who founded it, those who were influenced by it, many of them see themselves as children of Malcolm X. And in some ways, I guess I'd be like a grandchild, you know, because we continue that work, continue the legacy. Looking at the Constitution itself, we see that the 13th Amendment says, y'all know this, they made a movie about it and popularized it, you know, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude should exist except as punishment for a crime, you know. And so that brings the story that slavery was not abolished totally, it was just abolished in general, except if you can get somebody convicted of a crime, then slavery is cool, according to the 13th Amendment. But many people don't talk about the 14th Amendment, which say all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. When that was passed, there was no census of how many Africans there were in the United States who were not born in the United States. There was no census or plebiscite of, do you want to be citizens of this nation that has conquered you and captured you for the last 200 to 300 years. There was no census of what is the treaty by which these Africans can discuss with the United States their terms of engagement with the United States. It was very much a one-way contract. You now are citizens of the United States after we've captured you, abused you, called you not people, and now you're citizens. And so the 14th Amendment, definitely no peace processes. You know, the 14th Amendment is a very one-way contract. It's not a bilateral contract. It's not any sort of agreement. I know y'all did some stuff about Frantz Fanon, and one of the things that strike me about him is he talks about striking back against the oppressor, striking back against the colonizer, is how the native regains their humanity. And he talks about, he was a psychologist, psychiatric psychologist, talks about the insanity of being colonized. And when you strike back, when you detach yourself enough to say, you know what, I'm gonna hit them where it hurts, that's actually where colonized people get their sanity. And so again, this notion of nationhood, this notion that the United States is not the ultimate jurisdiction over our people collectively, it gives you a deeper way to strike back. It gives you what I would say would be a deeper sanity. And then lastly, moving from racial analysis to colonial analysis, I think that new conversations open up where we can shift from claiming that we're different races to asking the questions of how have we been colonized by the same forces? How have we been colonized? How have you been colonized? How have you been? It's a different conversation when you're talking about quote unquote people of color and you're talking about building solidarity. It's a different conversation than if you start at we're different races, than if you start at we're different nations that have all been colonized in this same space. It opens up a different conversation and it opens up a different sovereignty. And so one of the things that we talk about is, and I think I got like one more minute, there's some good history that I'm not gonna have fully time to get.
Indulge, go for it.
Indulge, all right, I'll indulge. Is through a process of hundreds of years, many of us were taken from different parts of Africa, different people, different tribes, in which we were, you know, different nations, different languages, and what was formed was a new nation. On this hemisphere, there are many nations that were formed, but in terms of the United States, we call it the New African Nation, which formed literally from forbidding us from speaking our language. It formed from the physical abuse. It formed, like, in Africa, they would have been different nations, and they would have been like, yo, you your nation, you your nation. But in America, over these centuries, a new nation was actually created. And this nation was colonized and held captive by the United States. And I like how Charles Mills talks about sub-personhood, because when you look at world news, you look at the newspapers, you see that, you know, I heard you talk about like the Native American and the Medicare and that type, they have treaties. And they like, yo, this is our treaty of 18 whatever. And even if the United States violated, they still talk about they had a treaty. And you can hold somebody to that. You know, a peace process. They always talking about peace processes. You know, is Trump going to get into negotiations? Is he going to have a peace process? These are human things that our people never got a chance to do. And so when we talk about sub-personhood, part of what we're talking about is, do we see ourselves as having the dignity that other people around the world are demanding to have by their enemies, by their oppressors, by those who they're in conflict with? You know what I'm saying? Palestine wouldn't just say, okay, Israel, you know, whatever you say, we'll just write it in your constitution and we'll just go along with it. You know what I'm saying? Hell no. They're going to sit at somebody's table somewhere, and if they don't like it, they'll storm off, and then they'll come back, but there's going to be a process. We ain't had no process. Anybody got any peace? Anybody got any treaties that New Africans signed? Do we have a treaty of 1865? Do we have a treaty of 1765 that we sat at a table and made some decisions? And so the Republic of New Africa was actually declared in Detroit in 1968. This is the 50th anniversary coming up next weekend. It's very significant. Think about it. Why would they declare it in Detroit? Detroit is deep, y'all. It was a gathering of over 500 black nationalists that gathered in 1968. There's a who's who of black people that were there that were present. They called themselves the Malcolm X Society. But at the same time, in Detroit, the Detroit police raided the first anniversary conference in 1969. In Jackson State, 2 students were killed and 4 students were injured in 1970. In 1971, the Jackson police raided the Republic of New Afrika headquarters with heavy arms, tear gas, warrants, and even a tank. 1 police officer were killed, and 11 RNA, they call them the RNA 11, were arrested. And so this idea has faced severe military and police reprisal to such an extent that 50 years later, many people have never heard of it. Many people don't even know it exists, whereas when it was created, many and most of the best black power minds were either present, affiliated, or nearby this thing. You see what I'm saying? But yet, as the story progressed, that story hasn't been told. And so, lastly, like I said, y'all are all invited to come to the Charles H. Wright for the 50th anniversary commemoration. One of the initiatives we have is Up South, Down South, in which we view Southern organizations as our closest political allies, and we extensively and intentionally work to build relationships with organizations in the South. Like, did you know that in the state of Mississippi, they actually proposed emergency management policies in order to take control, because Jackson elected Chokwe Lumumba, and one of the first things they did was propose emergency management so that the state of Mississippi would have control over the city of Jackson. And so that's what I mean when I say up south, down south, is that the majority of black people is in the South. And the South has many, even though Detroit is kind of like an anomaly up here, the South has many majority black municipalities. And so we see our territory, we see our land, we see our nation as being based in the South, and we're just refugees. Most of us ran away from, our grandparents or parents were a few steps away from the lynch mob or from the corrupt police or, from the economic oppression of being an uppity Negro and whatnot, and so we're refugees up to the north, but for centuries, most of us were down in the South, you know what I'm saying, which is where this nation was formed. And so, in conclusion, this story, I just wanted to say, you're gonna hear a lot about Detroit, you're gonna hear a lot about the specifics, but like I said before, I wanted to introduce the question of African descendant people in this country. Detroit ain't special. The thing, they ain't doing it because Detroit starts with the letter D. It ain't that thing. They're doing it because Detroit is the biggest concentration of Africans, one of the most self-aware concentrations of Africans in the entire continent. That's where the colonization is coming from. And so I wanted to engage the conversation on what is this colonization on African descendant people, give you a new way to look at it, which hopefully can push to new work, new frameworks, and new connections. So thank you very much.
Right, yeah.